Welcome back to another episode of Chat with the Archaeologist, presented by the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project. I am your host, Chester Liwosz, and we're going to begin with a couple of announcements. Then we'll get into our guest spot, which this month will be Elliot Helmer from Washington State University. Now, we've got a lot going on, and I want to start off with the question that I get asked the most. Every day, I take a number of calls and emails about tours. It is exciting to know that you all are excited about tours. And it's encouraging to know that we're going to have this interest throughout the year. Unfortunately, we're not going to be resuming tours this month. We had hoped to resume by the end of this month, maybe early next month. We're going to have to push that back to July. A part of that is because in order to properly prepare for running tours, we have to make sure that we take enough safety protocols to ensure your safety and the safety of our tour guides, not just for infectious disease, but to ensure safety on the trails as well. So we're working towards that. We will be ready to start tours hopefully sometime in July, but this all depends on public health and safety orders on the federal and state levels, as well as our own internal evaluations of whether we can bring you tours safely right now. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out our partners at Los Luceros State Historic Site. They've got a lovely 18th century hacienda with even some down-the-line ties to Georgia O'Keeffe. So if you want to get into the outdoors, you can still socially distance, enjoy the beautiful grounds of Los Luceros. They will be happy to see you. And speaking of our friends at Los Luceros, once again this year we are presenting together a Mesa Talks lecture series. So we are returning with the Mesa Talks. If you caught Carly's talk last month, great. If you haven't caught her talk, you can find the link on the Los Luceros Facebook page, as well as our own Facebook page. The event is up on Facebook. And Carly's talk last month was amazing, so go check it out. And this month, I will be delivering the Mesa talk. That will be on sensory archaeology. So this is a topic that has been gaining popularity among archaeological scholars, particularly here in the Southwest and in neighboring regions. So if any of you know what phenomenology is, this talk's for you. If you don't know what phenomenology is, that's fine. I'll explain it and try not to use that word too much. So it'll be a fun talk. We'll get a lot of dazzling visuals as well as a bit of audio. So hopefully that'll be a treat for y'all. And that will be the evening of Wednesday, May 26th. So tune in. The live stream for that one is going to be over on Facebook because that's run by our friends at Los Luceros through the New Mexico State Historic Parks. So they are using the Facebook platform to stream it. After the stream, about a day or two later, we expect to be able to upload it to our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to find the replay there. So you'll be able to find it live on Facebook on Wednesday the 26th in the evening, and then you will be able to catch it as a replay on our YouTube channel as well. All right, other announcements. Petroglyph recorder training has begun, so the application process is closed. We had a lot of interest. A part of that is because of folks who were interested in 2020 who did not get a chance to train or begin recording, as well as an equal number of new applicants in 2021. This is very encouraging to hear that y'all are still interested and that the pandemic doesn't seem to have slowed down your interest in volunteering with our organization. For those of you who got in your applications by the very loose April deadline, you will have already received emails from me with your training materials, links to training videos, as well as to the recorder resources, which includes all the forms that we would normally provide for you in print. So do check those out, follow the links in the email, check out the videos, review them, especially for new trainees. we expect you to know that material before you do your field orientations. We will be scheduling those, but once again, state health and safety protocols as well as our own judgment of the situation is playing a factor in when we will schedule that. When we do believe that we are ready, we will send you a doodle poll, and by we, I mean I will send a doodle poll to everyone who has signed up, and we're going to probably have to break you up into probably 4 or 5 groups. So there's going to be 4 or 5 slots that we look for that there's enough people interested that we can do an orientation. That will be in person. So again, that's why we have to wait for health and safety restrictions to relax a little bit more. Again, you're expected to know the materials when you show up, so definitely review that in the meantime, and thank you all for your interest. All right, so I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment here, but I wanted to make sure that we covered all of that. We covered volunteering, we covered tours, we covered Mesa Talks. If you have any other questions about what's going on with Mesa Prieta, with other volunteer opportunities, you can find our contact information on our website. We do have other volunteer opportunities in addition to the petroglyph recording program. I'm the one that's overseeing the training for the petroglyph recording, but we have other dedicated volunteers and board members who are deeply involved in training our other volunteers. And so if you decide that recording is not for you, whether or not you've signed up for the training, there will be other opportunities as well. So reach out to us. Our contact information is on our website. And of course, be sure to follow us on social media here on YouTube and on Facebook. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, as well as to ring the notification bell so you can get an update when we go live. As you frequently hear on this stream, when I forget to mute my phone, you'll hear a little ding at the beginning. Yep, it's showing that we're live. So I'm going to mute that, and we're going to get back to business. Thank you all for tuning in. This month is going to be a special treat, and let's get into it. All right, so I'm here with fellow banana slug, Elliot Helmer, who is now doing their doctoral research at Washington State University. And I've got on your name title bar here, PhD candidate. You did just advance to candidacy, right? So first off, congratulations. Elliot and I actually know each other from Santa Cruz, and since Santa Cruz, you've been at Washington State, is that right? Can you tell us a little bit, before we get into your PhD research, a little bit of the work you did on your master's, as well as maybe some of your side projects? All right, folks, sorry about that. We are missing Elliot's audio right now, and yeah, I'm aware of that. Everything was working fine, and now it's not. So I'm going to have to be troubleshooting live on air, unfortunately. Let's see here. Everything should be active. Let's see here. Let's pop over in the... Yeah. No, we can't hear you right now, and I don't really know why. So these technical difficulties happen, folks, and I'm sorry about that. See here, we're not muted over here. It's definitely on my end because I can hear you. I can hear you coming through my headset just fine. Let's see here. I'm not really sure how to fix it either. Can you try talking again?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Testing.
we got you loud and clear now.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that, everybody, but it wasn't my fault. Thank God. As I told Chester, I wouldn't have been able to fix it.
Blame me. Right before we went live on air, I was joking about how I was kind of just thrown into the deep end with this software. So I didn't have any prior experience in video production, really at all. So yeah, sorry about that. We're back. Wanted to go back to I think where we picked up was so Elliot is a fellow banana slug, is currently doing their doctoral research at Washington State University, and you just advanced to candidacy, right?
Yes, I did a couple of weeks ago. So I'm officially a PhD candidate instead of a student. So, all
right, congratulations. And as you said, when folks couldn't hear you,
yeah,
candidacy sounds like it's not a big deal, but it really is.
Yeah. You're done with classes, but now you have to write the whole dissertation, which is sort of the whole PhD thing. So.
Yeah. But it also means that you've got a solid idea of what you're doing for that, which takes a lot of legwork and research. And I think a lot of folks who haven't gone through that might not appreciate the sheer amount of effort that has gone into reaching this point. So congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's basically proving that they can stop holding your hand and sort of just let you loose. You have to prove it to them. But
it's a wonderful way of putting it. Next, I think I had asked you, what did you do for your master's work, and if you wanted to talk a little bit about your side projects before we get into your PhD research.
Yeah. So I have been at Washington State University for 4 years, and the first 2 of those were doing my master's. And my master's research was looking at settlement pattern analysis in Southern Oregon, which is basically trying to figure out why people choose to live where they live and looking on a big regional scale. So it was a lot of fiddling with fancy mapping software and sort of trying to understand the choices that people make about where they're going to live and how those choices are mediated through important cultural frameworks such as ancestors and the presence of ancestors in these places. So that was my master's research, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit later when I do my spiel. So you'll get more of that. And then side projects, I have been working in southwestern Oregon along the Oregon coast basically my entire career. I started out, like Chester said, I went to UC Santa Cruz, but I started out at Southern Oregon University in Ashland. And I've been collaborating with one of the professors there since that time. And so we're currently working on a project out in Coos Bay with the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, which is a really exciting project because it's part of their traditional cultural property nomination. So they have tried to nominate a large portion of Coos Bay as a traditional cultural property because it is very important to their tribe's cultural heritage, and it is being threatened by a pipeline. So this project is sort of on the front lines of heritage preservation, which is pretty exciting. So that's what I'll be doing this summer, in addition to my actual job, which is just cultural resource management out in California. So yes, yeah. So cultural resource management is if you've ever heard of the idea of like doing an environmental impact report for like a construction project, to make sure you don't build your building over the habitat of some rare owls or something. Basically, we have laws in the United States that require the exact same thing, except instead of making sure that you're not damaging rare owl habitat, you're making sure that you're not damaging archaeological sites. And so there's a bunch of federal and state laws and regulations that require any development using state or federal money to have archaeologists come out and make sure that you're not going to destroy things. And if you are, if there's just no way around it, to make sure that we get as much information as we can before those resources are impacted. So that's what I am actually employed doing. But I have all sorts of other random little research side projects. But yeah.
All right. So cultural resource management is, for those of you interested in archaeology who may not necessarily want to go all the way through to your PhD, is definitely a career option. There are folks who make a career out of archaeology in cultural resource management with just a bachelor's degree.
Yeah, that's where 90% of archaeologists actually work, and yeah, you don't need graduate school to do it.
So yeah, now tell us about what you're aiming for your PhD thesis, dissertation.
Yeah. So for my dissertation, I sort of had to reframe my dissertation project because of COVID. Originally, that side project that I just described was going to be my PhD, but because of COVID, we thought that it was going to be canceled and never come back. So I ended up putting together a project with a different tribe in Oregon, the Colville Indian tribe, who had a huge shell midden, which is just a big, big pile of old shell, basically, that people had harvested and eaten. And they had excavated it in 2018 and hadn't been able to do anything with that. And I came in and said, well, hey, I can do that for free. So my dissertation research is looking at that site and sort of situating it within the broader cultural history of that area, and really trying to think about how we can apply concepts of Indigenous kinship to understanding relationships with the environment, and thinking about how people manage resources and make resource procurement decisions from this sort of kinship framework, which I will talk about again later, of how I think that sort of is more culturally relevant to the way that Indigenous people in the past were actually viewing the environment. So I'm very interested in applying Indigenous perspectives to our understanding of, Indigenous past.
So I'm going to jump back in for just a moment. Last month, some of you may remember that I at least attempted to give a primer on some rather heady concepts like landscape agency, placemaking, and persistent places. I'd like to hand the mic back to Elliot. Would you mind sort of describing these sort of prerequisite concepts before we do our deep dive?
Yeah. So placemaking is a really, really broad topic, and it, at its most broad, refers just to the process of attaching meaning to specific locations, to places, right? And so in this framework, the idea of places refers to these locations that have some sort of cultural meaning. And this can be a very structured process, which you see like a lot in like places like the United States, very structured placemaking, where they say we're going to build a monument to try to construct purposefully a specific meaning. But then also there's just everyday acts of placemaking, the places that you attach your own personal meaning to, that your family attaches meaning to, that your like community attaches meaning to. And that's all tied up into this process of placemaking. And so when you're thinking about Indigenous places, these are places that live in the community's hearts, basically. These are places that they have attached meaning to over thousands and thousands of years, to create places in this cultural landscape. And then persistent places is basically the idea of, obviously you can sort of piece together what it means. Just it's a place that is persistent. It's a place that is revisited and reused over and over and over again, and a place that sort of lives in the collective consciousness of a community. Even if people leave and return to it, it's always something that is in your mind as a place in your sort of perception of the landscape. And obviously, persistent places have a lot of meaning attached to them, because as people continue to revisit them, you recursively add more and more meaning, and the meaning is, it's sort of moving back and forth between like that place and you. So Chester mentioned the idea of landscape agency. This is sort of this idea that the land has its own agency, the agency just being the ability to enact change in the world, right? And so by adding meaning to these places over and over and over again, those places then sort of, they have their own agency that they issue back to people, right? Where they, because of the meaning attached to these places, people want to return to them. They are being drawn back to those places by those places. Now the places are sort of tied up in this process of settlement decisions, which is sort of what I did for my master's thesis. So they're all really tied up in this idea that these places can have their own agency, and often they have their own agency inherently. It's not, they don't have their agency because people gave it to them, but there are a lot of places that are just inherently full of their own agency because they are like inherently special sacred places, especially like, really important like landscape features like certain mountain ranges and springs and waterfalls and stuff like that.
And so this is very important for understanding what's coming up next on Elliot's slides, is that these landscapes are agents, not just, this is a difference between the Western worldview and Indigenous worldviews, which is, Elliot, a major focus of your research, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know where you want to pick up, but do you want to take over from there?
Yeah, I mean, just let me know when you want me to get into my slides.
Oh, go ahead.
Right now? Okay, good, because otherwise I'm just going to start talking and I won't have any... It's easier to think about some of these things with pictures. So basically, just broadly, I'm going to be talking about how Indigenous ontologies, and don't worry, I'll define all these terms, get used in archaeology and how they can really benefit archaeology and provide a better understanding of archaeological pasts of Indigenous people. And so, there we go. So an ontology is, Chester just said the word worldview, right? You can think of an ontology sort of as a worldview, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that, where you think about ontologies fundamentally are challenging the immutability of reality. They're saying that reality is not just an objective thing that you can observe objectively and everybody sees it the same way. Reality is constituted constantly by people, and different people in different communities, especially in different cultures, have sort of slightly different realities. Because of the way that they function in the world, and because we create our own realities, if you're coming at it from a different cosmology, if you're coming at it from a different context, your reality is going to be slightly different than other people's realities that are operating in sort of different ontologies. So an ontology is basically these constituted realities. And within an ontology, every ontology has a different understanding of like, what are the rules that govern how things work in this world? What are the agents in this world? Like, what entities in this world make up reality, and which of those entities have their own agency? And so this is a really key difference between sort of Western ontologies, which see humans really as the only ones with true agency, and then animate beings like, animals have some amount of agency, but it's different from humans fundamentally. Whereas in a lot of Indigenous ontologies, that difference doesn't exist. Like the agency that animals and plants and the land itself and the water, these all have their own agency that is equal to the agency that humans have. And so sort of the way that I think about ontologies as sort of distinct from this idea of worldviews, a worldview, right, is like the lens that you are viewing the world through, right? Like, and in this picture, there is an objective world, right? There is like a thing that everybody is looking at, but because everybody has different lenses, they're all viewing that objective thing differently. So they have different world views. Whereas ontologies and ontological thought in archaeology, and this is a whole realm of philosophy that you could really get into, but just to, not put too fine a point on it, basically the ontology is that world itself, and it's saying that it's not just people have different lenses looking at it, it's saying that they have fundamentally different things that they are looking at. So it's not just about the lens, it's about like the thing that you're viewing through the lens. And so on that point, Indigenous ontologies basically is those realities that Indigenous people are operating in. And obviously Indigenous peoples are incredibly diverse. They're all over the world. They're in different situations, in different environments, different contexts. And so obviously there is no Indigenous ontology, right? That's why it's plural, Indigenous ontologies. But despite the fact that they are very, very diverse, Indigenous scholars have noted that there are general commonalities that sort of run through all of these worldviews that make it possible to sort of discuss them broadly as like a unified sort of thing, but then also part of the thing that unifies them is the fact that they are all drawn directly from the land. So obviously, if everybody is coming from a different place and everybody has a different landscape that they are from, your ontology is going to be different. So sort of inherent in the commonalities of Indigenous ontologies is the difference, right? And so basically, I'm just going to run through some of these commonalities, and then I'm going to get more in depth into the ontologies of the people that I work with. So Indigenous ontologies broadly, like I said, they're very highly localized. They're very specific and from the land. That's sort of one of the things that really defines Indigenous people as Indigenous is their histories with the land that they are from. And especially in North America, the land is sort of the first being, right? And land being is something that has agency, just like humans, and that it is from the land that all the rest of that culture comes from. So you learn your culture from the land, you learn who you are from the land, the land speaks your language. All of these things come from the land, and that is something that we see sort of across the board in Indigenous ontologies. So obviously they're all going to be very different based on their histories in their landscape. Another sort of commonality with Indigenous ontologies is that they are relational, which basically means that reality is constructed out of our relationships with other things. Things don't exist independently of each other. What they are and what they mean is defined by how they relate to other things. And so you can't really separate out things like the land or people or animals or really anything separate from each other. They're all composed of their own relationships. And we see this a lot in Indigenous philosophy and Indigenous activism. Like this book title that I have up here, All Our Relations. This is a classic book about environmental justice from an Indigenous perspective, viewing this idea of the environment in terms of our relations to the environment. The key thing also about this idea of relations and relationality is that the thing that is sort of guiding these relationships, the framework that these relationships are built on, is based in kinship, right? So you're not, obviously all ontologies have different relationships with things, but whereas in like a Western ontology, your relationship to the land might be primarily extractive, like you take things from the land, you control the land. In most Indigenous ontologies, instead what you see is a more kin-based relationship with the land, where the land is another being full of agency that you have to interact with sort of on the same terms that you would interact with your own kin, right? And so this is based on reciprocity, this is based in respect, this is based in like a mutual relationship between two like fully present beings. So it's a very different kind of framework from which all environmental interactions are coming from, right? Because the way that you interact with the environment is going to be fundamentally different when you believe that the environment is like a thinking being that can make choices. So obviously, if you're going to try to manage the environment or just make a living from the environment, that is going to involve building relationships with the environment, or the environment might take away those things from you. So I sort of mentioned this, right, is that my research focuses on the southern Northwest coast. And it's important to talk about this place because the ontologies that I'm talking about are drawn from this landscape, from these places. So the southern Northwest coast refers to sort of the area around the California-Oregon border. It's the sort of the southernmost expression of like the classic Northwest coast culture area. So if you're thinking like totem poles and plank houses and all that stuff, this is sort of the southernmost extent of that sort of cultural phenomenon. We don't have totem poles in this area, but we do have plank houses. And the peoples that lived in this area are very, very diverse. You can sort of see from this map that there are some areas, this is like a language map, and there are some like language areas that are so small they couldn't even fit the name of the like language on the map because it is so highly concentrated. This is just like the westernmost corner of Oregon that you're looking at. It's a very, very small area with a huge amount of linguistic diversity. And part of that is because the people in this area are also very, very autonomous. They didn't think of themselves in these broader categories, like, you know, they didn't think of themselves as Upper Coquel. You really didn't think in big terms like that. You were really focused on your own individual family and sort of your village, which was mostly your extended family, but you didn't have these big overarching government frameworks. You didn't have these big overarching political frameworks. And we're going to talk about that later, about why that sort of plays into how I view some of these other relationships with the landscape based coming out of this sort of social network that is fundamentally very, very autonomous and very flexible. So just to sort of orient you to where we are, my approach is, right, I'm talking about Indigenous ontologies, I'm talking about Indigenous perspectives, and I am not Indigenous. So obviously I need to be drawing on the voices and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, specifically Indigenous peoples from this area. So I do draw on sort of theory that's broadly developed by Indigenous scholars to talk about those sort of commonalities that I mentioned, but I do really, really rely on the Indigenous voices of the peoples from the areas that I work. And so what I really do when I approach an archaeological site is I do as much reading about the question that I have from the Indigenous perspective to sort of guide my interpretations. So I do a lot of reading of ethnographic data. So this area saw a lot of early ethnographic work in basically people from UC Berkeley, anthropologists from UC Berkeley going in and interviewing older Indigenous people who remembered what it was like to live in their villages before the white people came. So they were often elderly by the time that any white people were interviewing them, but they held a lot of really important knowledge. And I have some pictures of some of those people up here. Annie Miner Peterson and Coquel Thompson are two really important ones, but there are others. And then I also, I make sure that I include a lot of contemporary Indigenous perspectives, right? Because to focus just on these like older informants from like the early 1900s sort of paints this picture that there are no more Coos or Coquel people, right? Which is just not true. The Coos and the Coquel are still living in their traditional lands and are still very, very connected to these places, and they have a lot to say about these places. And so I also draw on writings from contemporary Indigenous scholars from this area. Ashley Cordes is a communications professor now at University of Utah, and I draw a lot on her work with relationality and archaeology. And George Wasson Jr. was an elder from the same tribe, and he has a lot of really, really interesting perspectives. So I take this knowledge and I use it to guide my interpretations, right? Because the people who know the most about the Indigenous past and the people who can say the most about the Indigenous past are those people's descendants. So I really try to guide my understanding of those pasts using these sort of perspectives. So I'm going to give you a couple of different examples here of how applying Indigenous ontologies can change our understanding of the archaeological record and our understanding of the past, and how it can change it in what I think is both an important way for thinking about like giving sovereignty back to Indigenous peoples, but also, well, not giving it back to them, but acknowledging their sovereignty. And also, I think just fundamentally, you are not, as an archaeologist, going to be able to understand the past unless you are using these kinds of frameworks where you are understanding it from the perspective of the people who created that archaeological record, right? If you're fundamentally misunderstanding the way that they saw the world, if you're trying to analyze it from a Western ontology, you're not going to understand the choices that those people were making in the past, because that's fundamentally not the reality that they were sort of interacting with. So these are some figures from my thesis research. The picture here, the map with all the little dots on it, is basically a map of my study area. Again, this is that same corner of southwestern Oregon. And you can see here all of these archaeological sites that I included in my study. And what I was interested in is, how do people decide where they live, right? What are the underlying factors determining where people choose to put their settlement? And I sort of looked at this from the traditional archaeological understanding of this would be, okay, well, they're going to have to live where they can like get food, right? Obviously, all people need to eat. They're going to try to decide where to live based on where those resources are. And in this area, that would be stuff like, where can you fish for salmon? Where are the best places to gather acorns? Where are the best places to hunt deer? Also, like, where are the river confluences? So where do the rivers meet? Because that's basically like being at the intersection of a busy street, right? This is great for getting to a bunch of different places. So basically, I crunched all of that data together. Where are all of these important things? And I produced the map that you see. I don't know what direction you guys are looking at the screen. For me, it's on my right. The map without the site. And you can sort of see these lighter areas are the areas that are the best places to live based on those criteria, like how close is it to salmon, how close is it to deer, how close is it to acorn. And you can sort of see that it's the coastline and these interior river valleys are like the really good places to live. And so if you're not considering this from an Indigenous perspective, you go, okay, well, there you go, that's where people are going to live. You know, I compared where the sites actually are to this map, and I said, okay, yeah, that is where the sites are. I think that I've captured what is informing the placement of settlements. However, when you dig into it a little bit further, you realize that there are a lot of really, really good places to live in Southern Oregon, like a lot of really great places. But you don't see people filling out into all of those great places. People are concentrated around places where people already lived. They're not filling out into the landscape to just get every single good place, right? They are just returning over and over and over again to these places that they have already lived. And we see these persistent places that are sort of drawing settlement towards them. People are choosing to live in the same places over and over again, even though there are lots of really, really good places to live. And I, objectively demonstrated, look how many places you can live. But notice how people are just returning to the same places over and over again. And that sort of is contradictory to these like traditional archaeological models of, there's all these models called ideal free distribution, which is basically people are going to fill out into all the good places in the landscape. And that's not what we see. But which doesn't, seem logical from a Western ontology. But when you read the Indigenous ontology, you see that people were very aware of the places that their ancestors lived, and they were not just aware of these places, they had connections to those places. Ancestors are living sort of beings in their world that you can interact with, and you can engage with your ancestors and these long histories of practice that your ancestors had in these places by returning to those places. So here's some cool images that I have of these top two pictures here are at a very important salmon fishing place, a very important ceremonial place for beginning to salmon fish every year. And you can see that these two people here in the circled area, one of them is an anthropologist, and the other one is a Takelma man named a Takelma man named Francis Johnson. And this here next to this is a picture of his daughter, Agnes Baker, who is a beloved elder who recently died, in the same place, connecting to her father and these long histories of her people performing these ceremonies in these places. And you see contemporary Indigenous people talking about how these connections to their ancestors in these places is so important. And in this picture, yeah, okay. I'm good. I have a timer. So you also see in this picture right here, these are two Tolowa women pointing out house pits at an archaeological site, which demonstrates that like they know where things are. They can walk into an archaeological site and recognize these places, which tells us that they probably are choosing these places based on like oh, look, somebody's already lived here. Our ancestors lived here. We should settle here. Rather than just any old, like, great place next to a salmon stream, right? So I've sort of taken this approach and zoomed in, right? That was a regional look. And so I've also really zoomed in on these like specific places and specific persistent places and tried to tease apart the histories. So this is a persistent place at the Bandon Marsh in Southern Oregon. It's on the land of the Colville Indian tribe. This place is really, really interesting because this part of Southern Oregon is prone to tsunamis. It's because of the tectonic activity, basically the North American plates pushing up against the Pacific plate and just causes periodic tsunamis. And you see that information about tsunamis really embedded in their oral histories. And they talk about this idea that people who understand the history of that place, because they have long-standing relationships to that place and know that they have to prepare for such events, they would braid ropes and tie the ropes to their canoe and tie them to the tops of trees so that when tsunamis came, they wouldn't be washed away. And the people that didn't have that long-standing knowledge in that place and didn't know to prepare for these tsunamis would be washed away by these events. And a Coquel tribal member named Jason Yonker talks about these ropes sort of metaphorically, thinking about them as oral histories, right? These are the lessons that you learn from your elders that tie you to these places and help you weather these sort of dynamic landscapes. And so I sort of take that perspective and I apply it to the archaeology of this specific site, where we see that people are living in an incredibly dynamic environment. The environment is infilling actively from a prior tsunami. So basically, the kinds of resources you're able to get in that area are changing, like from year to year, right? Like people are having to adapt to this really dynamic landscape. But rather than say, well, we used to be able to get like this kind of shellfish here, and now we can't anymore. So we're just going to move to where we can get that kind of shellfish. We see that they actually just hold on to these places, and they sort of have this back and forth with the environment where they say, okay, if this is what you're giving us, we're going to work with you on this. And we see that they sort of tether themselves to these places, even if they are incredibly dynamic. And they have to make choices to stay in those places as the environment changes. So this sort of demonstrates that these are active choices to stay in these places where they have these long-standing relationships. And this is sort of a future direction, right? This is not something that I have results for because this is my dissertation, right? So ongoing. But using this sort of perspective, I'm planning for my dissertation to analyze our people's relationships to the environment and the way that they procure resources. I'm planning to analyze this from sort of a kinship perspective, where these animals and plants and resources are being embedded into human social networks the same way that like a new person would be embedded into a social network, right? So I have this, you can sort of see how this approach might be useful by just looking at like a side-by-side of a food web. Like this is like the animals in their environment, the intertidal zone in its environment, compared to a human social network. You can see that they are very, very similar. And so it makes sense that we could understand human decisions about resource management and procurement by just simply embedding the human social network with the social network of the intertidal food web. And I sort of mentioned that the people in this area are very, very autonomous. They don't have these overarching hierarchies. And so it makes sense that instead of managing the environment from a very top-down hierarchical, the humans have a specific idea of what they want from the environment, and they're going to impose that on their environment. I think that what we're actually going to see when I dig through the archaeological record is, my hypothesis is that instead we will see this more autonomous sort of hierarchical, so like horizontal relationships rather than like hierarchical vertical relationships. Because if your social network with people is not organized that way, why would your relationship to the environment be organized that way? So I'm going to be approaching the analysis of this site with the hypothesis that we'll see this more embedded sort of horizontal social network where they're meeting the environment at its needs and respecting what it's looking for, and sort of having this back and forth relationship with the environment, which I believe will ultimately produce a much healthier environment when you understand those networks that are already existing, and rather than trying to impose yourself top down to manipulate those environments, sort of entering into a relationship with those relationships that those species already have. And that's sort of the direction that I'm hoping to take this research, which I hopefully think will also be useful for thinking about how we can manage these kinds of environments in the present using the knowledge that Indigenous people had in the past. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope that I don't think that I went over. Yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Chester.
Oh, my bad. I must have muted my mic while I was bringing you back on. So sorry, folks, for the technical issues this month. I was talking about this instance of vandalism in Utah, specifically around Moab. This petroglyph panel is colloquially referred to as birthing rock, and it was recently vandalized with both obscenities, as you can see on the screen here, as well as the words white power. In fact, the word white seems to have been written, scratched out, and then rewritten next to the word power in a way that is directly superimposed over the prior indigenous rock art. So our guest that we had about 2 months ago, Liwosz brought up an interesting perspective on this, and there was a link to an article that he wrote in the description down below, as well as displayed here. Liwosz points out that this is an act of oppression. Here we see it very overtly, but at the time that he wrote the article, it was in response to some events that were a little bit more subtle. Specifically, there was a 20-something young woman, her name's in the article, I'm not going to mention it here, who went on a just under a month tour of the American West, stopping at several national parks and national monuments, and leaving a number of drawings, paintings on the rocks, and then proceeded to boast about these on social media. So, of course, law enforcement caught up with this individual, but the hiking community came to her defense using such phrases as, well, if cavemen could do drawings. And so, first I want to talk about the comparison that these folks defending her are making, the comparison that they're drawing between quote-unquote cavemen, presumably implying Paleolithic, as if those individuals are closer to Native Americans today than Native Americans are, to the rest of us, which is obviously a racist position. Implicitly, but people aren't necessarily always aware of that implicit position. But then Liwosz also brings up that there's sort of an implication of power. And so one of the other defenses of this individual was comparing what she had done to street art. And so Liwosz is able to pull apart that distinction there of folks who are engaged in street art, such as at those linked down below with hold on a sec. There's a link down below with a link to an instance of street art in Australia of an image of a wombat that was actually preserved when it wasn't supposed to be. And I mean, this does kind of highlight the position of privileged artists. That artist could in fact be compared with Banksy, where Banksy's artistic expressions are valued, while others who are putting just as much time and artistic effort into street art are being criminalized. So yeah, there's a social disparity there, and a part of that is because we treat these things differently when they come from a position of power than when they come from a position of resistance. So when someone puts the words white power and these, profanities that you can see there on the onto indigenous images, then that is actually a display of dominance and an act of oppression. And I was wondering, before we move on to the next article, Elliot, if you wanted to say anything about that.
Well, God, I think that really, this is sort of goes to show why these sorts of topics that I'm interested in, these ideas of placemaking and attaching place to these important, sacred meaning to these important sacred places, is incredibly relevant when we think about archaeology, in the present and controversies around archaeology and indigenous sovereignty, especially because, petroglyphs are markers of indigenous connections to place, right? They're telling stories and quite literally physically inscribing meaning onto these places, not just stories, but physically inscribing meaning onto these places. And it demonstrates, therefore, petroglyphs demonstrate these long-standing histories and relationships with these places, and to vandalize them and to sort of draw over them is it's basically trying to obscure those connections to place, right? It's like a colonialist act of I know that this place is yours and we can see your connections to these places, but we reject your long-standing indigenous connections to these places and put over it our vandalism. And you can see that this is explicitly what vandals are doing, because at least these vandals had the decency to just be straight up with what they were doing and say white power, when really all vandalism of indigenous rock art sites is functioning in that sort of colonialist way. And I'm just getting all riled up about it, but I think that it does really connect well with these ideas that I was just talking about.
Absolutely, and I was thinking about how in your current research, people are treating landscape not just as having agency and having personhood, but as having a relationship like kin. And when we think about landscape kinship, then shooting rock art, for example, using it as target practice, which we see examples here at Mesa Prieta. As some of you might remember, I make the argument that Mesa Prieta is a persistent place. So when people are doing that, they're trying to break that connection, that persistent social connection between people and place, as well as they are taking pot shots at something with personhood. And it shows the degree to which that they are dehumanizing indigenous peoples, both past and present, by treating the landscape, which is essentially their kin, as target practice.
Yeah, it's violence, and it's not violence as sort of an abstracted concept of violence against property or something. It's violence against a being, that does have personhood. So it's incredibly destructive on a whole range of levels, aside from destroying a very beautiful heritage site. It's destroying like a, you know, a being, and it's destroying, it's trying, well, it's trying to destroy those connections to land. But you know, indigenous people are very, very resilient and aren't going to let graffiti destroy their connections to these places.
That's very encouraging. There's a lot of tangents we could take off of this topic, but thankfully we've stayed focused so far. So before we go off on any tangents, I want to bring up the next, which is with the Colville Tribes. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
So Elliot, do you want to introduce this one?
Yeah. So, you know, Chester was asking if I had any sort of in the news sort of archaeology topics, and this isn't like explicitly archaeology, but I think it really relates um, to my talk, and it relates to how archaeology can be leveraged by indigenous peoples. So I am currently based out of Eastern Washington, and one of the indigenous groups out in Eastern Washington is the Confederated Tribes of the Colville, and they have a bunch of different tribes and bands within their like current federally recognized group, and some of those peoples have traditional homelands in Canada. And obviously, just because a border was drawn between the United States and Canada, that doesn't mean that those connections to those places have been severed. And so recently, a sort of civil disobedience campaign on the part of a member of the, I think it's the Sinixit, one of the Lakes bands from this tribe, which is one of the tribes that has in this larger confederation, yes, Sinixit, that has ties to Canada. Canada declared this group extinct in the 50s because they said that the last living member of the band had died, which is not true. They had been relocated to Washington State on the other side of the border. And so Canada says they don't exist anymore. And so in order to challenge that ruling that these people are extinct and challenge this, their connection to the land being severed by this international border, a Colville activist, and he worked for their Fish and Wildlife department. He engaged in civil disobedience hunts in Canada, in British Columbia, on his traditional homelands. He engaged in ceremonial hunting to basically elicit the Canadian government to acknowledge his people's rights to their homeland. And so they recently won their case in the Canadian Supreme Court and were declared unextinct, which is kind of a ridiculous concept that a group of people who have been actively living just on the other side of the border had to engage in civil disobedience and take this all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court to be acknowledged that they do actually still exist. But that was a huge success for Indigenous rights, and it really demonstrates this idea that these connections to the landscape are fundamental to Indigenous identity and defining Indigenous people and indigeneity. And so we see how these connections to land are really at the forefront of like a lot of Indigenous struggles. So I don't know if you have any thoughts. Yeah, and you really see a long history of this kind of activism in Washington State. There's it's known as the fishing wars or the fish wars, I think, of Washington State, where similarly indigenous activists participated in civil disobedience fishing until they were given their fishing rights back by the Washington State government. So this is like a long-standing history of this kind of activism in Washington State tribes. So yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't even get me started on California water policy. It's killing all the salmon up in Klamath country. So it's it's a disaster. But I will say, just on the term of this idea of international borders, this just goes to show this idea of the difference between the way that Western people interact with the land and the way that Indigenous people interact with the land is like, Western people draw a line on a map and say, this is our land because we've drawn a line on a map. Whereas Indigenous people, your rights to the land doesn't come from something like property or map making. It comes from relationships that are maintained with these places, with this landscape, using the landscape for these purposes. Um, and so this idea that you can say that no, Canada owns this land and the United States owns this land, and because you're on that side of the line, you don't have connections to this land, fundamentally misunderstands the way that Indigenous people relate to the land and maintain these kinds of relationships with the land. Oh,
And okay, so it appears when I switch scenes that the mic is flipping on its own. Um, so sorry about the unusual number of technical difficulties, everyone.
bad luck.
Yeah, the software has a mind of its own. I wanted to recap some of the stuff you probably didn't hear. Is we talked about the how the issue with the Colville straddling the U.S.-Canada border is reminiscent of the Tohono O'odham straddling the U.S.-Mexico border, both with more contemporary issues like we've previously covered in this channel with the border wall and the use of high explosives on burial grounds by federal contractors building the border wall late in the last administration, as well as some intergenerational issues where some Tohono O'odham from the Mexico side of the border served with the U.S. military under the promise of receiving citizenship, and neither they nor their children nor their grandchildren have actually received that citizenship. Then we talked about the water wars in California. And I've verified my mic is on, third time's a charm. And how even some of our California residents may not realize that while the official story is that this was an uprising by farmers, that many of those farmers were indigenous Shoshone and Paiute, whose livelihood and subsistence was being taken away from them to provide water to Los Angeles. And then you talked briefly about the Klamath, but I think we got you on there. So
Yeah, it's Klamath, Yurok, Karuk. There's a bunch of groups up there, but it's in the Klamath watershed, the river, not the tribe. But yeah. I think that my mic was working, hopefully.
Yeah, I could see your levels. I thought that I was seeing my own levels, but no, I had to scroll down there. So yeah, we'll get those technical issues sorted out next time. Thank you everyone for tuning in. If anyone wants to follow up and contact you, Elliot, how will they do that?
You can message me on Twitter. My Twitter is @ArchHelmer, ArchHelmer. It's probably the easiest way to contact me. But yeah, I think Chester can post that information somewhere, probably, right? I hope.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, you can contact me there.
All right. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Elliot, for our guest talk. Once again, folks, I want to apologize for the technical difficulties. As you can tell, we've been trying to update the stream, and we've been trying to do that fairly consistently. There were a lot of updates to the beginning of this season, and there have been incremental ones with each month. There's still a couple of things that clearly I need to smooth out, but tune in next month, and maybe they'll be smoothed out. So for June, we have a guest speaker lined up, and if you'll just bear with me here, our guest speaker will be talking about Chaco Canyon, and let me just verify who that is. All right. Oh, there we go. Our guest speaker next month is going to be Paul Reed, who will be talking about Chaco Canyon. So check in next month. I'll have everything sorted out. Enjoy your weekend, everyone. And remember to follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and I'll see you on the next one.